Robert Louis Howard was a man whose name echoed through the Special Forces, a name synonymous with courage, sacrifice, and unparalleled heroism. His story is not just the story of a soldier, it's the story of an American legend. Having deployed 5 times to Vietnam, he is the most decorated soldier in the war, and perhaps the most remarkable part of his story. He was the only soldier ever nominated 3 times for the Medal of Honor. His actions, his resolve, and his willingness to go beyond the call of duty set him apart. Born on July 11, 1939, in Opelika, Alabama, Robert was raised in a family forged by sacrifice. His father, Charles Howard, was drafted into World War II, and his mother, Martha, worked long hours in a textile mill to support the war effort. For the first few years of Robert's life, his grandmother helped raise him. Those early days would shape the man he would become. His father and one of his uncles were both paratroopers in the legendary 101st Airborne Division. Their stories filled young Robert's imagination and heart, planting the seeds for what would become a lifetime of service. It was those stories that would lead Robert to join the army at the age of 17, just a month after high school graduation on July 20th, 1956. In the beginning, Robert worked his way up the ranks steadily. He earned an associate degree in business administration from the University of Maryland in 1962 and served in the army for a few years. But everything changed when, in 1965, he was deployed to Vietnam with the 101st Airborne, his father's old unit. It didn't take long before Howard's raw courage and unwavering determination were put to the test. After being wounded in battle during his first deployment, Howard was recruited into the Special Forces. He quickly adapted to the covert, high-risk nature of Special Forces missions, including the top-secret Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies, and Observations Group. The SOG was a covert unit running dangerous cross-border operations in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, some of the most perilous missions imaginable. Howard didn't just survive the war. He became one of its greatest warriors, carrying out missions in some of the deadliest terrain. One operation stands as a defining moment in his life, a moment that would forever etch his name into the history of heroism. It was December 30th, 1968, and Howard, now a sergeant first class, was leading a platoon on a rescue mission deep inside enemy-controlled Laos. Their mission was to rescue a team of soldiers who had gone missing, possibly captured or killed. The platoon had been inserted via helicopter into a designated landing zone, but as they moved out, a much larger enemy force attacked, ambushing them from all sides. It was a nightmare. Within minutes, Howard was wounded. His hands were blown up and burned beyond recognition, and his weapon was destroyed. He couldn't stand, couldn't walk, but what he did next would define his character forever. He saw his platoon leader, First Lieutenant James Gerson, lying exposed, severely wounded. There was no hesitation. Despite his own injuries, Howard crawled through a hail of bullets to get to him. But the enemy wasn't finished. A bullet struck one of Howard's pouches, setting off several magazines of ammunition, sending him flying through the air in an explosion of fire and shrapnel. He was blasted back, but in the midst of the chaos, Howard realized that somehow he wasn't too badly injured to continue. With the help of another sergeant, Howard dragged Lieutenant Gerson back toward the disarrayed platoon. Under the brutal fire, he rallied the remaining soldiers into a defensive position. "We're going to establish a perimeter right here," Howard told them, "and we're going to fight or die." It wasn't just a plan, it was a challenge, and Howard's leadership transformed that moment into a stand that would define the fate of the platoon. Howard had the platoon set up strobe lights to signal their position and called in air support. In the midst of the firefight, the enemy had to cross a small tributary to get to their position, which gave Howard's platoon the upper hand. For hours, Howard ignored his own pain, crawling from position to position, tending to the wounded, keeping the platoon's spirits high. With air support, they fended off multiple attacks. It wasn't until the first light of dawn that they were able to get a helicopter to land and evacuate the survivors. But that victory was bittersweet. As the helicopters arrived, Howard made sure every single man, both living and dead, was loaded onto the helicopters before he himself climbed aboard. But Lieutenant Gerson, the man Howard had fought so hard to save, died on the way to safety. That hurt me worse than being shot up, seeing that lieutenant die, Howard would later say. Of the 37 men in Howard's platoon, only 6 survived the battle. If it weren't for Howard's bravery, it's unlikely that even one would have made it out alive. But despite the recognition, Howard wasn't focused on accolades. As he recovered in the field hospital, he learned that he had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. But Howard didn't feel worthy. "I didn't succeed in finding the team that had been captured," he said later, recalling his commander's orders. However, as time went on, he would learn that some of the men from the missing team had survived and were taken as prisoners of war. Howard stayed in Vietnam, continuing his service with the Special Forces, and by 1969, he was commissioned as an officer. From Master Sergeant to First Lieutenant in one swift leap, Howard's rise was extraordinary. By 1971, he was promoted to captain. But in February of that year, after an intense, grueling career, he learned he was finally being sent home to receive the Medal of Honor. On March 2, 1971, President Richard Nixon awarded Robert Howard the Medal of Honor at a ceremony in the White House. Howard was joined by his wife Tina and their daughters. But even as the nation honored him, Howard's thoughts were with his family, specifically his 3 uncles who had died in World War II. He dedicated the honor to them, ensuring that their sacrifice was never forgotten. "I always try to maintain the dignity and the honor of having it bestowed upon me," Howard said, forever humble. By the time Howard completed his 5 tours of duty in Vietnam, he had spent 55 months in combat, been wounded 14 times, and earned 8 Purple Hearts. Between 1968 and 1969 alone, he was recommended for the Medal of Honor 2 additional times, but those recommendations were downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star, the 2nd and 3rd highest military awards. His service record stands as one of the most decorated in American history. Howard didn't rest on his laurels. After earning a bachelor's degree from Texas Christian University in 1973, he went on to complete 2 master's degrees in the 1980s. He even made appearances in Hollywood, performing parachute jumps for John Wayne's film The Longest Day and serving as an airborne instructor in the Green Berets. But his real legacy wasn't on the silver screen. It was in the lives he touched as a soldier, leader, and mentor. Howard's personal life was marked by change. After a divorce, he remarried and had 2 more children, Roslyn and Robert Jr., who followed in his footsteps and joined the Army. Howard retired in 1992 after 36 years of service. He continued to serve his country through the Department of Veterans Affairs, and for years, he spoke to young troops about the importance of service and sacrifice. In the early 2000s, he was inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame and the Army Aviation Association of America Hall of Fame. For the final years of his life, Howard lived in San Antonio, Texas. On December 23, 2009, he passed away at a hospice in Waco after battling pancreatic cancer. His final resting place: Arlington National Cemetery, a fitting tribute to a man whose life was defined by service to his country. His name continues to resonate. The 5th Special Forces Group headquarters building at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, was named Howard Hall in 2013, and in 2021, a plaque dedicating the Special Operations Command Career Campus was unveiled at Camp Humphreys. An overpass along I-85 near Auburn University in Alabama was also named for him. In December 2024, a book about his extraordinary life, Beyond the Call of Duty, The Life of Colonel Robert Howard, was published, ensuring his legacy would live on for future generations. Robert Howard's life was beyond anything words could fully capture. He wasn't just a soldier, he was an embodiment of honor, bravery, and the unbreakable human spirit. His story will never be forgotten. His legacy will always inspire.